about sex. This is a poem about sex.
Hey!
It ought to be funny. It ought to be hot. It ought to be full of love. But it's not. Sex makes me angry, and this poem will be angry. I'm going to tell some stories going back to generations. I heard that my paternal grandfather was the ugliest man my mother ever saw. Short guy with a hooked nose and rheumy eyes, whose compromise was a beautiful but very fat wife as wide as she was tall. He had 2 handsome sons and a daughter he adored, and a secret daughter left behind with the first wife he abandoned in Poland when he stole all the money from the family safe and ran away to America. He dressed the adored daughter up like a doll in clothes from his very own shop before the chemicals used to process the cloth killed him by leukemia at only 41. He was a lousy businessman anyway who listened to communists and unionized his own fucking factory. Oh. What kind of sorry excuse for a man is that? This is a poem about sex. So, let me tell you about my maternal grandparents, both children of alcoholics. Grandfather's father died one night riding his bicycle drunk into the path of a speeding locomotive, leaving my grandmother to raise her children by herself. My beautiful grandmother's alcoholic father was the heart of generosity, but married my grandmother's mother on the promise he would teach her to read. This was after her true love died, and she was facing a life alone. But my grandfather's father continued to read his Russian novels and never taught his wife anything except to hate the booze and teach her daughter to hope that she would never have sons. And this is a poem about sex. So, I'm going to tell you about how my mother's beautiful mother and my handsome grandfather met one day in a community play and ran away, singing and dancing, and this is a poem about sex. On their wedding night, Grandma was so tight they couldn't make love. They consulted a doctor, who opened her up mechanically like a tin can. And after that, she always hated sex, although she loved my grandfather. And when she told the story, she'd say, "I guess it's too bad. I think I missed out on something." And she never complained about his mistress, whom I thought was my aunt. Oh. And my mother's mother and my mother's father had 2 daughters that stopped there, even though it took an abortion. And that was my mom and my auntie. And Grandpa loved his daughters so much, he often climbed into their beds when they were teenagers. And my mother would get up and go downstairs and practice the piano, while her sister would grind her teeth and hug her daddy, learned to hate him too. And my mother never told me that story until I was 40, but often complained about how her father would embarrass her mother in restaurants by flirting with the waitresses with the filthiest language and then leave 2 generous tips. And this is a poem about sex. And I don't even know how to tell you about my sister being attacked by boys when she was only 10 and how they broke her ribs, but didn't penetrate her, and she dressed like a boy for years afterward until she lost her virginity to a man over 30 when she was only 13. And this is a poem about sex. So I'm going to tell you about how when I was 11 I had no friends or anybody else to tell me about puberty, and how I figured it out for myself and thought maybe I was going to die, but I couldn't stop, and I didn't know what was going to happen, and I didn't even know where I learned the word, but I looked up masturbation in the dictionary and figured out what was what, and that I wasn't going to die, and my fucking father was a pediatrician, but nobody ever explained anything to me. And this is a poem about sex. At 13, I was such a mess, my parents sent me to a shrink. He was as big as a house. after 3 visits, he called a family conference and told my parents he thought my problem stemmed from my being homosexual and not wanting to admit it, but he wasn't 100% sure. And that fat fuck asked me in front of my parents if this were true. So I said, well, I supposed I was too young to know, and we'd wait and see. And we never talked about it again. And this is a poem about sex. And now I'll tell you how when I was 15, I started hitchhiking to get around the city, and men would grab my crotch and offer me money, and I'd pretend not to notice and never told. And I fell in love and kept it a secret. And one day the boys said, we can't be friends anymore, everybody thinks we're fags. And so we weren't. When I finally had a first experience, it was with a stranger in a one-room studio in Hollywood who advertised for a roommate at the gay community center where I'd gone to come out. He seduced me very sweetly with pot and hugs, but then would only lie there while I did him and wouldn't touch me. And afterwards made fun of me when I wanted to cuddle. He offered up some chocolate chip cookies and told me we wouldn't meet again because, after all, I really wasn't his type. And I'm telling the secrets in this poem about sex. My first lover was a 17-year-old street hustler who spoke 3 languages, looked like a young Peter Fonda, and had been thrown out of his home by a homophobic mother. When we settled into our apartment and he was off the street, he invited one of his old Johns to come have dinner with us and see how well he was living. The man sat in our living room and played with himself until I felt nauseous, but my boyfriend said it didn't matter. He left me for a man twice my age, and then at 30 he died from AIDS. I experimented with strangers in bathhouses. I picked up thugs in bars. I played at public sex on the sand in Laguna Beach, and once in the bushes behind the Lincoln Memorial. I became an alcoholic. Later, I met my second lover, and we drank together for 3 years before he disappeared one day, leaving me to a long, confused series of one-night stands and passionate crutches, until the alcoholic storm of my 20s and 30s and 40s tossed me up on the shore of my 50s, confused, lonely, ill at ease, full of appetite, and really pissed off. This is a poem about sex, and I warned you it would be angry. But I'm still the same boy I have always been. The body says this is a lie, but in my head and my heart, it is the truth. And I am just as vulnerable and beautiful as ever. Urge and urge and urge, said the good great poet. Always the procreant urge of the world. That's my fucking poem about sex.